The silence was deafening. One moment, 15,000 spectators at the San Antonio Stock Show and Rodeo were on their feet, screaming and cheering as Mason Tully gripped the bull rope atop Tornado Red. The next moment, the only sounds echoing through the Alamodome were the frantic bellowing of the bull and the urgent voices of paramedics rushing across the arena dirt. Mason lay motionless, face down in the arena sand, his arms twisted at unnatural angles. The veteran cowboy who had conquered bulls across America for 12 years couldn't feel his legs. He couldn't feel anything below his neck. The realization hit him before the medical team even reached his side. This wasn't like the other falls, the broken ribs, the concussions, the dislocated shoulders that came with the territory. This was different. This was permanent. Don't move him. Nobody touch him. Dr. Sarah Chun, the rodeo's head physician, sprinted across the arena, her medical bag bouncing against her hip. She had seen countless injuries in her 15 years working rodeo circuits, but the way Mason had landed, neck first, with the full force of a 2,000-pound bull's momentum behind him, sent ice through her veins. Jake Martinez stood frozen at the chute gate, his own bull rope forgotten in his hands. He watched his best friend and traveling partner of 8 years lying in that horrible stillness, and for the first time in his adult life, Jake felt completely helpless. They had shared hotel rooms, meals, victories, and defeats across every major rodeo circuit in North America. They had pulled each other from bars when drinking got too heavy after bad rides, and they had celebrated together when prize money was good. But there was nothing Jake could do now except watch as Mason's life changed forever in the span of 8 terrible seconds. The crowd, initially shocked into silence, began to murmur with growing concern. Cell phone cameras came out, despite arena security's attempts to maintain some dignity for the fallen rider. Social media would explode within minutes with grainy videos of the accident, but right now, in this moment, the focus was on saving whatever could be saved of Mason Tully's future. The evening had begun like so many others over the past 12 years of Mason's professional career. He had arrived at the Alamodome at 3 o'clock that afternoon, 4 hours before the evening performance, following the ritual that had become as natural as breathing. First, he walked the bucking chutes, studying each bull that would be ridden that night, memorizing their tendencies, their preferred spinning direction, their particular quirks that could make the difference between a successful 8-second ride and a trip to the hospital. Tornado Red had caught his attention immediately. The massive black bull stood nearly 6 feet tall at the shoulder and weighed over 2,000 pounds of pure muscle and attitude. His hide was scarred from years of rodeo competition, and his eyes held the intelligence of an animal who had learned to hate the cowboys who climbed onto his back. In his 5-year professional career, Tornado Red had been successfully ridden to the 8-second buzzer only 12 times out of 93 attempts, a bucking average that put him in the elite tier of professional bull riders' livestock. "That son of a gun's been extra rank this season," commented Bill Henderson, a veteran stock contractor who had been providing bulls for rodeos since before Mason was born. "Threw 3 boys last weekend in Houston, and one of 'em landed so hard we thought he might not get up. You sure you want to take your chances with him tonight?" Mason had studied the draw sheet carefully. In the championship round, riders were matched with bulls based on their season standings and the difficulty ratings of available livestock. Drawing Tornado Red meant the judges believed Mason was capable of handling one of the most challenging bulls in professional rodeo. But it also meant that any mistake would be magnified by the bull's explosive power and unpredictable movement. "Bill, I've been riding bulls for 12 years, and I didn't get this far by backing down from the tough ones," Mason had replied, though privately he felt the familiar butterflies that accompanied every ride. "Besides, if I can stay on that black devil for 8 seconds, the score should be high enough to win this whole thing." The mathematics of professional bull riding were unforgiving. Riders were scored on a scale of 0 to 100 points, with 50 points based on the bull's performance and 50 points based on the rider's control, spurring action, and style. Tornado Red's high difficulty rating meant that a successful ride would likely score in the mid to high 80s, which would be enough to move Mason from second place to the championship in the final standings. Rebecca had been watching from the family section, her hands resting on her 8 months pregnant belly as their 4-year-old daughter Emma bounced excitedly in the seat beside her. Emma was wearing a miniature version of her father's signature black cowboy hat and a T-shirt with his competition number, 37, emblazoned on the front in silver letters. The little girl had been attending rodeos since she was 6 months old, and the sounds of cheering crowds and bucking livestock were as familiar to her as lullabies. "When is Daddy going to ride, Mama?" Emma asked for the 5th time in 10 minutes, her excitement building as the evening progressed through the preliminary rounds toward the championship finale. "Soon, baby girl," Rebecca answered, though her own anxiety was growing with each passing minute. She had watched Mason ride hundreds of bulls over their 15-year relationship, but she never became comfortable with the inherent danger of his chosen profession. Every time he climbed over the chute rails and settled onto a bull's back, she held her breath until he was safely back on solid ground. In the contestant area behind the chutes, Mason went through his pre-ride preparation routine with the same methodical precision he had developed over 12 years of professional competition. First, he stretched his shoulders, back, and legs, knowing that flexibility could mean the difference between absorbing a hard landing and sustaining a serious injury. Then he wrapped his hands with athletic tape, paying particular attention to his riding hand, which would be his only connection to the bull during the 8-second ride. The bull rope itself was a crucial piece of equipment, custom-made to Mason's specifications by a leather craftsman in Oklahoma who had been making bull ropes for 3 generations of rodeo cowboys. The rope was flat-braided manila hemp with a leather grip that had been shaped to fit Mason's hand perfectly. A cowbell attached to the rope's tail would help pull it free from the bull after Mason dismounted, preventing the dangerous situation of a rider being dragged by an angry bull. "You ready for this, partner?" Jake asked as he helped Mason prepare his equipment. Jake would be riding in the 7th position of the championship round, 3 riders after Mason, and the 2 men had developed a ritual of helping each other through the nervous energy that preceded every important ride. "I've been ready all season," Mason replied, working rosin into the palm of his riding glove to improve his grip on the rope. "This is what we came here for, a chance to win the whole thing in front of the home state crowd." The 2 men had been traveling together on the professional bull riders circuit for 8 years, sharing expenses and supporting each other through the physical and emotional challenges of a sport that demanded absolute commitment while offering no guarantees of success. They had started as competitors and evolved into something closer than brothers, their friendship forged in the camaraderie of shared risks and mutual respect for each other's abilities. Dr. Sarah Chun had been the on-site physician for the San Antonio Stock Show and Rodeo for 7 years, and she had developed a reputation among riders for her skillful treatment of rodeo injuries and her understanding of the cowboy culture that many medical professionals found difficult to navigate. She positioned herself in the arena during every performance, carrying a radio that kept her in constant communication with the ambulance crews stationed outside the venue. As the championship round began, Dr. Chun felt the familiar tension that accompanied the most dangerous phase of every rodeo. The championship round featured the top 15 riders in the season standings matched against the 15 most difficult bulls available, creating combinations that pushed both human and animal athletes to their absolute limits. The level of competition was highest, which meant the risks were highest as well. The first 4 rides of the championship round had been spectacular. 2 successful 8-second rides that scored in the low 80s, and 2 dramatic buck-offs that sent riders scrambling to safety while their bulls kicked and spun in celebration of their victories. The crowd was energized, sensing the quality of competition they were witnessing. Mason's name was announced as the 5th rider of the championship round. "Ladies and gentlemen from Amarillo, Texas, riding Tornado Red, Mason Tully." The crowd responded with enthusiasm, recognizing Mason as a hometown favorite who had represented Texas rodeo with distinction throughout his professional career. Behind chute number 4, Mason settled onto Tornado Red's broad back, feeling the bull's massive muscles twitching with contained energy beneath him. The bull was surprisingly calm in the chute, but Mason knew that Tornado Red's reputation was built on explosive power that would be unleashed the moment the chute gate opened. Some bulls showed their temperament while confined in the narrow chute space, but the most dangerous ones saved their energy for the 8 seconds that mattered. "Take your time, Mason," called Tommy Wilson, a younger rider who looked up to Mason as a mentor. "Get your hand positioned right before you nod for the gate." Hand position was critical in bull riding. Too far forward and the rider would be pulled off balance when the bull dropped his head, too far back and the rider would lose leverage when the bull spun or kicked. Mason worked his gloved hand into the rope's handle, finding the grip that felt natural and secure. His thumb would be tucked under the rope with his fingers wrapped around it, creating a connection that needed to be solid enough to maintain control, but flexible enough to release cleanly when the 8-second buzzer sounded. "How does that feel?" asked Marcus Rodriguez, an experienced bull rider who was working as a pickup man that evening. Marcus would be responsible for helping Mason dismount safely after his ride, positioning his horse near the bull to provide Mason with an escape route when the time came. "Feels good," Mason replied, testing his grip by pulling against the rope. "This big guy's going to try to separate my shoulder from my socket, but I think I've got him figured out." Tornado Red shifted in the chute, and Mason felt the incredible power contained in the bull's frame. At 2,000 pounds, the bull outweighed Mason by a factor of 10 to 1, creating a mismatch that could only be overcome by skill, timing, and the kind of fearless determination that defined professional bull riding. The bull's shoulders were so broad that Mason had to stretch his legs wide to maintain contact, and the animal's muscular neck was as thick as a tree trunk. "Riders, this is your 2-minute warning," announced the chute boss, signaling that the performance was moving toward Mason's ride. "Get your man ready behind chute 4." Mason nodded to indicate he was prepared, but took another moment to visualize the ride ahead of him. Tornado Red typically came out of the chute with a hard left-hand spin, but he was capable of switching directions without warning, a trait that had caught many experienced riders off guard. Mason planned to position himself slightly to the right of center, allowing him to maintain balance if the bull spun left while staying prepared for a direction change. Rebecca watched from the family section as Mason settled into position atop Tornado Red. She had been through this process hundreds of times, but her anxiety never lessened. If anything, it had grown stronger since Emma was born and intensified again with her current pregnancy. The man she loved was about to engage in single combat with a creature specifically bred and trained to launch human beings through the air with maximum violence. "Is Daddy going to win?" Emma asked, standing on her seat to get a better view of the chutes where her father was preparing for his ride. "Daddy's going to do his best, sweetheart," Rebecca replied, though her own stomach was knotted with tension. She knew the statistics. Serious injuries occurred in approximately 1 out of every 15 bull rides, and catastrophic injuries, while rare, were always possible. Every rider signed liability waivers acknowledging the risks, but no amount of legal documentation could prepare a family for the reality of devastating injury. The arena lighting dimmed slightly as spotlights focused on chute number 4, where Mason was making his final preparations. The crowd's noise level dropped as spectators sensed the approach of what could be the ride that determined the evening's championship. In professional bull riding, single rides often determined season-long competitions, and the pressure on both rider and bull was immense. "Mason Tully, whenever you're ready," announced the chute boss, giving Mason control over the timing of his ride. Some riders preferred to sit on a bull for several minutes, feeling the animal's movement and energy, while others wanted to ride immediately before their nerves could build to uncomfortable levels. Mason took a deep breath, feeling his heart rate increase as adrenaline flooded his system. This was the moment he lived for, the intersection of preparation, opportunity, and raw courage that defined his chosen profession. Everything he had worked for during the current season came down to the next 8 seconds. "Outside," Mason called, signaling that he was ready for the chute gate to be opened. The gate swung open, and Tornado Red exploded from the chute like a coiled spring releasing its stored energy. The bull's first jump carried both rider and animal 6 feet into the air, with Tornado Red twisting his massive body to the left while kicking his rear legs high above his head. Mason absorbed the impact of landing and maintained his position, his free arm extended for balance while his riding hand gripped the rope with desperate intensity. For the first 3 seconds, the ride went exactly as Mason had anticipated. Tornado Red spun to the left with tremendous power, but Mason matched the bull's rhythm, spurring with his boots while maintaining the forward-leaning position that kept his weight centered over the bull's shoulders. The crowd roared its approval as man and beast engaged in their ancient contest of wills. Then everything changed. At the 3-second mark, Tornado Red planted his front feet and reversed direction with a violence that caught Mason completely off guard. The bull's powerful hindquarters whipped around to the right while his head dropped between his front legs, creating a combination of forces that no human body could withstand. Mason felt his grip slipping as his balance was destroyed by the unexpected direction change. For a fraction of a second, Mason was airborne, still connected to the bull only by his loosening grip on the bull rope. He had experienced this sensation before, the moment when a ride went wrong and the inevitable became unavoidable. Usually, this was when training and experience took over, when a rider's body automatically positioned itself for the safest possible landing. But this time was different. Tornado Red's direction change had been so violent and unexpected that Mason found himself falling forward rather than away from the bull. Instead of landing on his feet or rolling safely to the side, Mason was falling directly into the path of the bull's spinning hindquarters. The impact came at the 4-second mark. Tornado Red's massive right hip caught Mason in the chest, launching him through the air in a trajectory that would haunt the nightmares of everyone who witnessed it. Mason's body sailed 15 feet before crashing to the arena floor neck first, his spine compressing with a sound that carried over the noise of the crowd. A wet crack that seemed to silence the entire Alamodome. Mason hit the ground and didn't move. Not a twitch, not a reflexive attempt to roll away from danger, nothing. His body lay in the arena dirt exactly as it had landed, and the unnatural stillness sent a wave of horror through the crowd that had been cheering just seconds earlier. Tornado Red continued bucking around the arena, unaware that his work was done, that the contest was over in the most final way possible. The Bulls' victory celebration continued for several more seconds before the pickup men managed to guide him toward the exit gate. But by then every person in the Alamodome understood that something terrible had happened to Mason Tully. Dr. Chin reached Mason's side in less than 20 seconds, but those 20 seconds felt like hours to everyone watching. She immediately began her assessment, checking for vital signs while carefully stabilizing Mason's head and neck to prevent further injury to his spinal cord. "Mason, can you hear me?" she asked, her voice calm and professional despite the gravity of the situation developing under her hands. "I can hear you, Doc," Mason replied, his voice barely audible but clear enough to confirm that he was conscious and coherent. "But I can't feel anything. I can't feel my legs at all." The words sent a chill through everyone within hearing range. Dr. Chin had seen many spinal injuries during her rodeo medicine career, but the complete absence of sensation below the neck was an ominous sign that suggested severe damage to Mason's spinal cord. "Don't try to move," Dr. Chin instructed, though she could see that Mason was already making futile attempts to lift his arms or shift his position. "We're going to get you stabilized and transported to the hospital immediately." The emergency medical team was already surrounding Mason with specialized equipment. A spine board designed to immobilize his entire body, a cervical collar to prevent further damage to his neck, and monitoring equipment to track his vital signs during transport. Every movement was careful and deliberate, with multiple hands supporting different parts of Mason's body to ensure that his spinal column remained perfectly aligned. Rebecca was fighting her way down from the family section, Emma crying in her arms as they navigated through crowds of concerned spectators. The little girl didn't understand what was happening, but she could sense the panic and fear in the adults around her. Other riders' families were trying to comfort Rebecca, but everyone knew that words were inadequate for what was unfolding in the arena below. Jake Martinez stood at the chute gate, his own equipment forgotten as he watched the medical team work on his best friend. He had seen plenty of injuries during his 6 years of professional bull riding, but this was different. The complete stillness, the way Mason's body lay in the dirt, the urgent but controlled movements of the medical team. Everything suggested that this injury was as serious as rodeo injuries could be. "Is he going to be okay?" Jake asked Dr. Chun as she supervised Mason's preparation for transport. Dr. Chun looked up briefly, her expression revealing the concern she was trying to keep professional. "We won't know anything definitive until we get him to the hospital and run some tests. But Jake, you need to prepare yourself and help prepare his family for the possibility that this is a very serious spinal injury." The words hit Jake like a physical blow. He had always known that catastrophic injury was a risk in their sport, but it had always been an abstract possibility, something that happened to other people in other places. Watching Mason being carefully loaded onto a spine board, completely immobilized and unable to move voluntarily, made the danger of their chosen profession devastatingly real. The ambulance pulled up to the arena entrance, its red and blue lights casting eerie patterns across the faces of the crowd that had gathered to watch Mason's departure. The transport process was methodical and slow, with every movement designed to prevent further injury to what might be a severely damaged spinal cord. "Rebecca," Dr. Chin called out as Mason's wife reached the arena floor. "You can ride in the ambulance with us, but I need you to stay calm for Mason's sake. He needs to see strength from you right now." Rebecca nodded, though her own emotions were barely under control. She handed Emma to Jake's girlfriend, Sarah, who had joined the group of supporters gathering around the medical emergency. "Take care of her for me," Rebecca whispered. I have to go with Mason. As the ambulance doors closed, Mason caught a glimpse of the arena where he had spent so many nights competing, where he had built a career and earned the respect of his peers, where he had planned to win a championship that would secure his family's future. Now that same arena was receding behind them as the ambulance screamed through San Antonio's streets toward University Hospital, carrying a man whose life had been irrevocably changed in 4 devastating seconds. The ride to the hospital took 18 minutes, but it felt like hours to both Mason and Rebecca. Mason drifted in and out of consciousness as his body dealt with the trauma and shock of his injuries, while Rebecca held his hand and whispered encouragements that she wasn't sure he could hear. "The babies are going to be so happy when you come home," she said, though part of her was beginning to understand that the man who came home might be very different from the one who had left for the rodeo that evening. "Emma's been practicing her roping, and she can't wait to show you her new tricks." But Mason's mind was focused on more immediate concerns as the ambulance raced through the Texas night. He kept trying to move his toes, to feel something, anything below the point where sensation had ended so abruptly. The absence of feeling was more terrifying than any pain could have been. It suggested damage that might be permanent, life-changing in ways he had never allowed himself to consider during 12 years of professional bull riding. University Hospital's trauma team was waiting as the ambulance pulled up to the emergency entrance. Dr. Amanda Rodriguez, the hospital's chief of spinal surgery, had been alerted about the incoming patient and had assembled her best team for what she suspected would be one of the most challenging cases of her career. "What do we have?" Dr. Rodriguez asked as Mason's gurney was wheeled into Trauma Bay 3. 34-year-old male professional bull rider fell from approximately 6 feet and landed on his neck and upper shoulders, reported Carlos, the paramedic who had treated Mason during transport. Complete loss of sensation and voluntary movement below the cervical level. Patient is conscious and alert, vital signs stable, but concerning for potential respiratory compromise. Dr. Rodriguez had seen the mechanism of injury before. The compression forces generated when a human body lands neck first from height were often sufficient to cause catastrophic damage to the spinal cord. The fact that Mason had no sensation below his neck suggested injury at a high cervical level, which carried the worst possible prognosis for recovery. "Mason, I'm Dr. Rodriguez," she said, leaning over the trauma bed so Mason could see her face. "We're going to take excellent care of you, but I need you to tell me exactly what you're feeling right now." "I can feel pressure in my head and neck, but below that, nothing," Mason replied, his voice hoarse from the combination of trauma and fear. "Doc, am I going to walk again?" The question hung in the sterile air of the trauma bay, and Dr. Rodriguez knew that her answer would be remembered by both Mason and Rebecca for the rest of their lives. She chose her words carefully, balancing honesty with hope, while acknowledging the limitations of what could be determined in the immediate aftermath of such severe trauma. "Mason, you have what appears to be a serious spinal cord injury. We won't know the full extent of the damage until we complete our evaluation and get some imaging studies. What I can tell you is that our team is going to do everything possible to give you the best chance for recovery." But privately, Dr. Rodriguez was already preparing for the likelihood that Mason Tully would never walk again, and might face challenges that would test every aspect of his physical, emotional, and psychological resilience for the rest of his life. The next few hours would determine not just the extent of his paralysis, but whether he would survive at all. As the trauma team worked around him, Mason stared at the ceiling tiles and tried to process what his life had become. 4 seconds ago, he had been a championship-caliber bull rider with a beautiful family, financial security, and a future filled with possibilities. Now he was lying paralyzed in a hospital trauma bay, facing an uncertain future that might not include any of the physical capabilities he had taken for granted for 34 years. The machines around his bed began their rhythmic monitoring of his vital signs, but they couldn't measure the breaking and rebuilding of a man's identity that was just beginning in Trauma Bay 3 of University Hospital's emergency department. 8 seconds had changed everything, and Mason Tully's real fight was just beginning. The neurological intensive care unit at University Hospital operated under its own rhythm, a careful balance of advanced medical technology and human vigilance that never truly slept. Room 314 had become the epicenter of a crisis that extended far beyond medical considerations, drawing together a community of people whose lives had been forever altered by 8 seconds of violence in a San Antonio arena. By 2 a.m., less than 5 hours after Mason's accident, the hallway outside his room looked like a rodeo staging area. Cowboys from across Texas and beyond had begun arriving, many abandoning their own competitions mid-event when word spread through the tight-knit professional bull riding community. The gathering included veteran riders who had competed alongside Mason for over a decade, young cowboys who looked up to him as a mentor, stock contractors who had provided bulls for his rides, and rodeo officials who had watched him develop from a promising rookie into one of the sport's most respected competitors. Jake Martinez hadn't left the hospital since arriving in the ambulance that had followed Mason's transport from the Alamodome. He stood in the hallway wearing his competition gear, chaps, spurs, and the number 42 that would have been his riding position in the championship round that had been suspended after Mason's accident. The irony wasn't lost on Jake that he was supposed to be preparing for his own title shot, but instead was keeping vigil outside his best friend's hospital room. "Any updates?" asked Tommy Wilson, who had driven the 3 hours from Houston where he had been competing in another rodeo when news of Mason's accident reached him through the social media networks that connected professional rodeo competitors across North America. Jake shook his head, exhaustion etched across features that had aged years in the span of a few hours. "They've been running tests all night. The surgeon came out about an hour ago and said they're going to operate, but she couldn't tell us much about what to expect afterward." The waiting room had filled with people who represented different aspects of Mason's life. His parents, Jim and Patricia Tully, had driven down from their ranch outside Amarillo, arriving with the kind of grim determination that ranching families developed when dealing with crises beyond human control. Mason's younger sister, Katie, had flown in from Denver, where she worked as a veterinary technician, bringing medical knowledge that helped her understand the gravity of her brother's condition even as she struggled with her own emotional response to his accident. Rebecca had been moving between Mason's room and the family waiting area, trying to balance her need to be with her husband with her responsibility to Emma, who was struggling to understand why Daddy couldn't come home and why all the adults around her seemed scared and sad. The 4-year-old had finally fallen asleep in her grandmother's arms, but even in sleep she clutched the miniature cowboy hat that matched her father's, as if holding on to a piece of the man who might never pick her up again. Dr. Rodriguez entered the waiting area at 3:15 a.m., still wearing surgical scrubs that betrayed the hours she had spent evaluating Mason's condition and preparing for the operation that would determine much of his future. The assembled crowd fell silent, understanding that they were about to receive information that would change their collective understanding of what lay ahead for one of their own. "I've completed my evaluation of Mason's injuries," Dr. Rodriguez began, her voice calm but weighted with the gravity of what she had discovered. "Mason has sustained what we classify as an incomplete C4, C5 spinal cord injury with significant cord compression and hemorrhaging. In layman's terms, his spinal cord has been severely damaged at the level of his 4th and 5th cervical vertebrae." Patricia Tully, Mason's mother, was the first to ask the question everyone was thinking. "What does that mean for his future, doctor? Will he be able to walk again?" Dr. Rodriguez had delivered this type of devastating news hundreds of times during her career, but it never became routine. Each family, each patient, represented a unique tragedy that would ripple through generations of lives. Based on the initial evaluation and imaging studies, Mason has suffered what appears to be complete paralysis from approximately the chest level down. He has some limited function in his shoulders and may retain partial use of his upper arms, but his hands, trunk, and legs show no voluntary movement or sensation. The words hit the assembled group like physical blows. Rebecca felt her knees weaken, and Jake had to sit down as the full implications of Mason's condition became clear. This wasn't a broken bone that would heal or a concussion that would resolve with time. This was permanent, life-altering damage that would affect every aspect of Mason's future. "There's more," Dr. Rodriguez continued, though she could see that the family was already struggling to process what they had heard. "Mason's injury is high enough on his spinal cord that it may affect his ability to breathe independently. We have him on a ventilator right now, and we won't know for several days whether he'll be able to breathe on his own. The possibility that Mason might require permanent mechanical assistance to perform the most basic function of life was almost too much for his family to comprehend." Jim Tully, a man who had spent his life dealing with the harsh realities of ranching, found himself confronting a situation that no amount of experience had prepared him to handle. "When can we see him?" Rebecca asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "He's being prepared for surgery right now," Dr. Rodriguez explained. "We need to stabilize his spine and relieve pressure on his spinal cord to prevent further damage." The surgery will take approximately 6 hours, and then he'll need several hours to recover from the anesthesia. You should be able to see him sometime this afternoon. As Dr. Rodriguez left to prepare for Mason's surgery, the waiting room fell into a silence that was filled with the weight of unspoken fears and unanswered questions. Each person present was processing the information according to their own relationship with Mason and their understanding of what his condition would mean for the future. Jake found himself thinking about the countless hours he and Mason had spent traveling between rodeos, sharing hotel rooms and meals while pursuing their dreams of championship success. They had talked about everything during those long drives across America. Their hopes for their families, their plans for life after professional bull riding, their shared love for a sport that demanded everything while promising nothing. Now those conversations seemed like artifacts from a different lifetime, when the future had seemed full of possibilities rather than defined by limitations. Emma woke up in her grandmother's arms, immediately asking for her daddy in the way that only a 4-year-old could, with complete expectation that her request could and would be fulfilled immediately. The adults around her struggled to find words that could explain a situation that defied their own understanding. "Daddy is with the doctors right now, sweetheart," Patricia Tully told her granddaughter, though she knew that the man who eventually returned from those doctors would be fundamentally different from the father Emma remembered. "He's hurt, and they're trying to make him feel better." The concept of permanent disability was beyond Emma's developmental comprehension. In her experience, hurt things got better with medicine and time, and doctors were magical figures who could fix whatever was broken. The idea that some injuries couldn't be healed, that some changes couldn't be undone, was not part of her 4-year-old worldview. Dr. James Patel, the hospital's head of neurology, had been brought in to consult on Mason's case due to the complexity of his injuries and their potential impact on his neurological function. Dr. Patel had worked with hundreds of spinal cord injury patients, and he understood that successful treatment involved far more than surgical intervention. It required a comprehensive approach that addressed not just the physical damage, but the psychological, social, and economic implications of permanent disability. "Have we talked to the family about long-term prognosis?" Dr. Patel asked Dr. Rodriguez as they reviewed Mason's preoperative imaging studies. "I've given them the basic medical information," Dr. Rodriguez replied, studying the MRI images that showed the extent of damage to Mason's spinal cord. "But I don't think they've fully processed what this is going to mean for their daily lives. A C4, C5 injury affects everything: mobility, personal care, employment, housing, transportation, family relationships, financial security. Their entire world is about to change." The two physicians understood that Mason's surgery, while critical for preventing further damage, was only the beginning of a journey that would extend for decades. Spinal cord injury recovery wasn't measured in weeks or months, but in years of adaptation, adjustment, and learning to navigate a world designed for people with full physical capability. Meanwhile, in the hospital's chapel, Rebecca sat alone in the front pew, her hands resting on her swollen belly as she tried to find words for a prayer that could encompass the magnitude of what her family was facing. She was 8 months pregnant with their second child, due in less than 6 weeks, and the prospect of raising 2 children while caring for a quadriplegic husband was overwhelming in ways she couldn't fully comprehend. The financial implications alone were staggering. Mason's career earnings would have to support the family for decades now, supplemented by disability insurance that would provide only a fraction of his previous income. Their medical expenses would be enormous, their housing would need to be completely modified for wheelchair accessibility, and Rebecca would likely need to become Mason's primary caregiver while also working to support their family financially. But beyond the practical considerations were emotional challenges that seemed even more daunting. Mason's identity was completely tied to his physical capabilities, his strength, his coordination, his fearless approach to controlling dangerous animals. How would he adapt to a life where he needed assistance with the most basic tasks? How would their marriage survive the stress of such dramatic role changes? How would Emma and their unborn child relate to a father who couldn't play with them, couldn't teach them physical skills, couldn't demonstrate the strength they would naturally expect from their dad? The surgery began at 4:30 a.m. and would continue until almost noon. Dr. Rodriguez worked with a team of specialists to stabilize Mason's cervical spine, remove bone fragments that were compressing his spinal cord, and install hardware that would prevent further damage to his already devastated neurological system. The operation was technically successful, but everyone involved understood that success in this context meant preventing additional damage, not restoring what had been lost. During the long hours of Mason's surgery, his family and friends maintained their vigil in the waiting room, sustained by coffee, vending machine snacks, and the kind of mutual support that develops among people facing crisis together. The Professional Bull Riders Organization had sent representatives to coordinate with the media and help manage the flood of support that was already beginning to arrive from the rodeo community worldwide. "The response has been incredible," said Linda Martinez, the PBR's Director of Rider Services, as she met with Rebecca and Mason's family during the mid-morning hours. "We've already received over $50,000 in donations to the fund we've established for Mason's medical expenses and family support. Rodeo people take care of their own, and Mason is family to a lot of people." The outpouring of support was both touching and overwhelming. Messages were arriving from riders, stock contractors, rodeo officials, and fans from every major rodeo market in North America. Professional athletes from other sports were contributing to Mason's fund, recognizing the bonds that connected all people who made their living through physical competition and understood the risks that came with that choice. But financial support, while critically important, couldn't address the fundamental challenge Mason and his family were facing: learning to rebuild a life that would bear little resemblance to anything they had planned or imagined. The man who had spent 12 years traveling the country to ride bulls would now face a future where simple tasks like getting dressed or preparing a meal would require careful planning and often assistance from others. Jake Martinez found himself thinking about a conversation he and Mason had shared just 3 weeks earlier as they drove between rodeos in Oklahoma and Texas. Mason had been talking about his plans for life after professional bull riding. Maybe buying a small ranch where he could raise cattle and train young riders, maybe working as a stock contractor providing bulls for rodeo competitions, maybe coaching at the high school or college level where he could pass on his knowledge to the next generation of competitors. All of those dreams had been shattered in 4 seconds of violence that nobody could have prevented or predicted. Instead of planning for retirement from bull riding, Mason would now face the challenge of learning to live with catastrophic disability while trying to maintain his roles as husband, father, and provider for his family. Dr. Rodriguez emerged from the operating room shortly before noon, her scrubs showing the evidence of the long, delicate surgery she had just completed. The waiting room fell silent as she approached Mason's family, everyone understanding that they were about to receive information that would define their understanding of what lay ahead. "The surgery went as well as we could have hoped," Dr. Rodriguez began, though her expression remained serious. "We were able to stabilize Mason's spine and relieve the pressure on his spinal cord. There were no complications, and his vital signs remained stable throughout the operation." The family felt a momentary sense of relief, but Dr. Rodriguez's tone warned them that difficult information was still coming. "However, I need to be very clear about what we found during the surgery and what it means for Mason's prognosis," she continued. "The damage to his spinal cord is extensive. While we were able to remove the bone fragments and stabilize his spine, the spinal cord itself has been severely damaged. Based on what we observed during the operation and the results of his pre-surgical evaluations, Mason will very likely have permanent paralysis from approximately the chest level down." Rebecca closed her eyes, though she had been preparing herself for this news since watching Mason fall motionless to the arena floor. Hearing it stated with medical certainty made it real in a way that hope and denial couldn't overcome. "What about his breathing?" asked Jim Tully, Mason's father, who had been most concerned about his son's dependence on mechanical ventilation. "That's still unclear," Dr. Rodriguez admitted. "High cervical injuries like Mason's can affect the diaphragm and breathing muscles. Some patients in his condition eventually regain enough respiratory function to breathe independently, while others require long-term ventilator support. We won't know Mason's situation for at least several more days." The possibility that their son and brother might never breathe on his own again was almost incomprehensible. They were being asked to process not just the loss of Mason's mobility, but potentially the loss of his ability to perform the most basic function of life without mechanical assistance. "When can we see him?" Rebecca asked, though part of her was dreading the moment when she would have to confront the visual reality of Mason's condition. "He's being moved to the neurological intensive care unit now," Dr. Rodriguez replied. "He'll be unconscious for several more hours as the anesthesia wears off, but you can sit with him. Just remember that he's been through major trauma, both physical and psychological." When he wakes up, he's going to need to see strength and support from his family. As Mason's gurney was wheeled from the operating room to the NICU, the group of people who loved him prepared themselves for a reunion that would be both joyful and heartbreaking. The man they were about to see would look like Mason Tully, but he would be fundamentally different from the person they remembered, a reality that would take months or years for all of them to fully accept and understand. Room 314 in the Neurological Intensive Care Unit became Mason's world for what would stretch into weeks of medical monitoring, slow recovery, and gradual adaptation to his new physical reality. The room was filled with equipment that monitored every aspect of his condition. Machines that tracked his heart rate, blood pressure, oxygen levels, and brain activity, creating a technological cocoon around a man whose body could no longer perform many of its most basic functions. Rebecca took her position in the chair beside Mason's bed, a spot she would occupy almost continuously for the next several weeks as she tried to balance her role as Mason's primary support system with her responsibilities to Emma and her advancing pregnancy. The stress was taking its toll on her health. She had already experienced several episodes of early contractions that forced her onto modified bed rest, creating the ironic situation of a pregnant woman caring for her paralyzed husband while dealing with her own medical complications. As the afternoon wore on and Mason remained unconscious, his family and friends took turns sitting with him, talking to him, and trying to maintain the connections that would be crucial to his psychological recovery when he finally woke up to face his new reality. Each person dealt with their own grief and fear while trying to project hope and strength for Mason's benefit, creating an atmosphere of determined optimism that masked profound uncertainty about the future. The machines surrounding Mason's bed continued their rhythmic monitoring of his vital signs, but they couldn't measure the more complex changes that were taking place. The gradual reconstruction of identity, purpose, and hope that would be necessary for Mason Tully to survive and eventually thrive in circumstances he had never imagined. The real challenge wasn't just learning to live with paralysis, but learning to find meaning and purpose in a life that would be completely different from anything he had planned. As evening approached, bringing with it the familiar sounds of a hospital that never truly slept, Rebecca placed her hand over Mason's still fingers and whispered words of encouragement that she hoped he could hear even in his medically induced unconsciousness. "I'm here, cowboy. We're all here, and we're going to figure this out together, one day at a time." The long night was just beginning, but for the first time since watching Mason fall motionless to the arena floor, Rebecca felt a small spark of determination growing within her despair. They would face whatever came next together as a family, with the same stubborn resilience that had carried Mason to the top levels of professional bull riding. The challenges ahead were enormous, but they weren't insurmountable. They were just different from anything any of them had ever imagined. 3 weeks and 2 days after the accident that had changed everything, Mason Tully drew his first breath without mechanical assistance since that terrible night at the Alamodome. The moment came at 6:47 a.m. on a Thursday morning that would forever mark a turning point in his long journey toward adaptation and recovery. Dr. Rodriguez and her respiratory therapy team had been working toward this goal since Mason's surgery, gradually reducing his dependence on the ventilator while strengthening his compromised breathing muscles through a combination of therapy and determination. The first sound Mason made after the ventilator tube was removed was a hoarse cough, followed by a whispered attempt to say Rebecca's name that sent his wife into tears of relief and joy. For 3 weeks, she had been communicating with her husband through touch, through reading his lips, through the kind of wordless connection that develops between people who love each other deeply. Hearing his voice again, weak and raspy though it was, felt like the return of a piece of Mason that had been lost in the trauma and medical intervention that had defined his existence since the accident. "Hey there, cowboy," Rebecca whispered, leaning close to Mason's face so he could see her clearly. Her own voice was thick with emotion after weeks of maintaining the kind of strength that crisis demands while dealing with her own advancing pregnancy and the constant stress of uncertainty about Mason's future. "You gave us a real scare there for a while." Mason tried to respond, but his voice failed him momentarily. The simple act of breathing independently required conscious effort and concentration that reminded him constantly of how much his body had changed. Every breath was a victory, but also a reminder that functions he had never thought about were now challenges he would face for the rest of his life. Dr. Rodriguez stood beside the bed, monitoring Mason's respiratory effort while trying to gauge his emotional state as he adapted to this new milestone in his recovery. She had seen hundreds of spinal cord injury patients reach this point, and she knew that breathing independently was often the first step toward accepting the reality of their new circumstances. It represented both progress and a harsh reminder that this progress was measured in increments that healthy people took for granted. "How do you feel, Mason?" Dr. Rodriguez asked, though she could read much of the answer in his facial expression and the tension in the muscles he could still control. "Like I got run over by a whole herd of tornado reds," Mason replied, managing a weak smile that didn't quite reach his eyes but represented his first attempt at the kind of humor that had always been his way of coping with adversity. "But I guess breathing on my own is a start." The joke was forced, but it signaled something important to everyone in the room. Mason was beginning to engage with his new reality rather than simply enduring it. For 3 weeks, he had been focused primarily on basic survival, on adapting to the frightening experience of complete physical helplessness, while his mind remained painfully sharp and aware of everything he had lost. The ability to make jokes, even weak ones, suggested that his psychological recovery was beginning alongside his physical adaptation. Dr. Patricia Williams, the hospital's head of rehabilitation medicine, entered the room carrying the thick folder of assessment forms, therapy schedules, and equipment catalogs that had become the roadmap for Mason's future. At 58, Dr. Williams had worked with hundreds of spinal cord injury patients, and she had learned that successful adaptation depended as much on mental resilience and family support as on medical intervention and physical therapy. "Mason, I'm Dr. Williams, and I'm going to be working with you on your rehabilitation program," she said, settling into the chair that had become Rebecca's permanent station beside Mason's bed. "Now that you're breathing independently, we can start focusing on rebuilding your life with the capabilities you still have." Mason's expression darkened slightly at the word capabilities. 3 weeks of lying motionless in a hospital bed, dependent on others for every basic need, had given him plenty of time to think about what his capabilities might be now, and the list seemed devastatingly short compared to the physical abilities that had defined his identity for 34 years. "Doc, I appreciate what you're trying to do," Mason said, his voice gaining strength as he became more accustomed to breathing and speaking independently. "But let's be realistic here. I can't move my arms more than a few inches, I can't feel anything below my chest, and I can't even scratch my own nose when it itches. What exactly are we going to rehabilitate?" Dr. Williams had heard this question in various forms from nearly every spinal cord patient she treated. The initial despair and anger were normal, even necessary, as patients began to process the magnitude of their losses. But her job was to help them discover what remained possible, even when those possibilities looked nothing like the lives they had planned. "Actually, Mason, your injury is classified as incomplete, which means you retain some function above the injury level," Dr. Williams explained, opening her folder to reveal detailed assessments of Mason's remaining neurological function. "You have limited shoulder movement, and with intensive therapy, we can potentially improve your arm function significantly. Your hands and fingers show no voluntary movement, but we have adaptive equipment that can help you perform many tasks independently." She spread several photographs across Mason's bed table, showing adaptive equipment designed for people with high-level spinal cord injuries. There were computer interfaces controlled by head movements, eating utensils with special grips, devices for holding phones and books, and sophisticated wheelchairs that could be controlled with minimal arm movement. "More importantly," Dr. Williams continued, "your mind is sharp, your personality is intact, and your determination, which got you to the top levels of professional bull riding, is still there. We're going to need all of that for what comes next." Rebecca leaned forward in her chair, desperate for any hopeful news after weeks of devastating medical updates and constant worry about how they would manage their transformed life together. "What does rehabilitation look like for someone with Mason's injuries? What can we realistically expect him to be able to do?" Dr. Williams opened another section of her folder, revealing pages of therapy schedules, progress tracking charts, and testimonials from other patients who had navigated similar challenges. "Mason will spend the next 6 to 8 weeks in our inpatient rehabilitation program. We'll work on transferring from bed to wheelchair, basic self-care skills like feeding himself and operating adaptive technology, and respiratory strengthening to prevent pneumonia and other complications." The mention of wheelchairs hit Mason like a physical blow, even though he had intellectually understood since the first day that walking was no longer possible. Hearing it discussed as a permanent part of his life, planning for it as his primary means of mobility, made the reality unavoidable in a way that lying in a hospital bed hadn't. "So that's it then," Mason said, his voice carrying the bitterness that had been building during the weeks of enforced helplessness. "Wheelchair for life, needing help with everything, watching from the sidelines while everyone else lives their lives. Some kind of life that's going to be." "Mason Tully, you listen to me right now," Rebecca said firmly, using the tone she reserved for their daughter Emma when she was being particularly stubborn. "You're still here. You're alive, you're breathing on your own, and you're still the man I married 15 years ago. We'll figure out the rest together, just like we always have." But Mason wasn't ready to accept that optimism. The man who had made his living by controlling 2,000-pound bulls through balance, strength, and split-second reflexes couldn't imagine a meaningful life where he needed help opening a water bottle or getting dressed. The identity crisis was overwhelming. Without bull riding, without his physical capabilities, without his role as the strong provider and protector for his family, who was Mason Tully? Jake Martinez had been visiting daily since Mason regained consciousness, bringing news from the rodeo circuit and updates on the foundation that had been established in Mason's name to help injured riders and their families. The Professional Bull Riders Organization had rallied around one of their own with remarkable generosity, raising over $400,000 in the 3 weeks since the accident. But Jake could see that Mason was struggling to find meaning in a life that looked nothing like what he had planned or expected. "The guys are all asking about you," Jake said during one afternoon visit, his own discomfort obvious as he tried to find the right words to maintain their friendship while acknowledging how much everything had changed. "Tommy Wilson won the championship round in Tulsa last weekend and dedicated his ride to you. Said he carried your spirit in the arena with him." Mason appreciated the gesture, but stories about other riders succeeding in the sport he could no longer participate in felt like salt in emotional wounds that were still raw and bleeding. "That's good for Tommy. I'm glad somebody's still living the dream while I'm laying here like a piece of furniture." The bitterness in Mason's voice was unmistakable, and Jake struggled to find a response that wouldn't sound like empty platitudes. The truth was that none of the riders knew how to relate to what Mason was experiencing. They could imagine broken bones, torn muscles, even career-ending injuries that would force early retirement. But complete paralysis was beyond their comprehension, and their well-meaning visits often left Mason feeling more isolated and different than ever. Emma had been brought to visit her father regularly since he regained consciousness, and her innocent questions and observations provided both joy and heartbreak for Mason as he tried to maintain his relationship with his daughter while coming to terms with how much that relationship would have to change. The 4-year-old was gradually beginning to understand that Daddy couldn't get up from his bed, couldn't pick her up, couldn't play the physical games that had been such an important part of their bond. "Why can't you come home with us, Daddy?" Emma asked during one visit, climbing carefully onto Mason's bed where she could see his face clearly. "Are you still sick?" Mason struggled to find words that could explain his condition in terms a 4-year-old could understand without frightening her or creating false hope about his recovery. "My body got hurt really bad, sweetheart, and it's going to take a long time for the doctors to teach me how to do things differently. But I'm getting stronger every day, and soon I'll be able to come home and be with you and Mama and baby David." The mention of his son brought another wave of complicated emotions. David had been born 2 weeks after Mason's accident, arriving slightly early as if sensing the family crisis that surrounded his entrance into the world. Mason had been present for the birth, wheeled into the delivery room in his hospital bed, but he had been unable to hold his son or participate in the experience the way he had when Emma was born. The baby was now 3 weeks old, and Mason had held him only a few times, always with assistance, always with the awkward positioning required by his limited mobility and arm function. Dr. Williams returned the next morning with Mason's first wheelchair, a temporary hospital model that would serve until he could be properly fitted for a permanent chair designed specifically for his needs and level of function. The moment represented another milestone in accepting his new reality, but Mason viewed it with dread rather than hope or progress. "We're going to start with some basic transfers," Dr. Williams explained as 2 physical therapists, Marcus Thompson and Jennifer Chun, positioned themselves on either side of Mason's bed. Marcus was a former college football player who had gone into physical therapy after his own career-ending knee injury, while Jennifer specialized in spinal cord injury rehabilitation and had worked with patients at Mason's functional level for over a decade. "The goal is to get you sitting upright and eventually moving yourself from bed to chair independently, or at least with minimal assistance," Dr. Williams continued. It's going to be challenging at first, but most patients with your level of injury can eventually learn to transfer themselves with the right equipment and training. The process was exhausting and humiliating for Mason, who had once deadlifted over 400 pounds and could control a bucking bull with subtle shifts in balance and weight distribution. Now he couldn't support his own body weight during the transfer, and every movement required assistance from the therapists. The sensation of being lifted and positioned like a child was devastating to his sense of dignity and independence. But the worst part was the complete absence of feeling below his chest level. It was like his lower body belonged to someone else entirely. He could see his legs being moved and positioned, but there was no sensory connection between what he was seeing and what he was experiencing. The disconnection was profoundly disorienting and served as a constant reminder that this wasn't a temporary condition that would improve with time. "This is progress, Mason," Dr. Williams said encouragingly as Mason slumped in the wheelchair, his body held upright by cushions and positioning straps that prevented him from falling forward or to the side. "In a few weeks, you'll be amazed at how much independence you can regain with practice and the right adaptive equipment." But Mason felt anything but independent. The wheelchair was uncomfortable, his balance was precarious without the trunk muscles that had been paralyzed by his injury, and the simple act of sitting upright left him exhausted in a way that 12 years of professional bull riding never had. This was supposed to be the beginning of his new life, but it felt more like a constant reminder of everything he had lost and would never regain. Rebecca had been watching the transfer process with a mixture of hope and heartbreak. Seeing Mason in a wheelchair made his condition undeniably real in a way that lying in a hospital bed hadn't quite accomplished. This was her husband's future. Not a temporary setback or a phase of recovery, but a permanent new reality that would affect every aspect of their lives together for decades to come. That evening, after Mason had been transferred back to bed and had fallen into an exhausted sleep, Rebecca sat alone in the hospital room and allowed herself to fully confront the fears and practical concerns she had been suppressing for 3 weeks. How would they modify their house for wheelchair accessibility? How would Mason participate in raising Emma and David when he couldn't pick them up, couldn't play physical games with them, couldn't demonstrate the kind of strength and capability that children naturally expected from their father? The financial implications were staggering and becoming clearer as she learned more about the costs associated with spinal cord injury. Mason's career earnings would need to last for decades now, supplemented by disability insurance that would provide only 60% of his previous income. Their medical expenses would be enormous and ongoing, their housing would need complete modification for accessibility, and Rebecca would likely need to become Mason's primary caregiver while also working to support their family financially. But beyond the practical considerations were emotional challenges that seemed even more daunting. Mason's entire identity was tied to his physical capabilities. His strength, his coordination, his fearless approach to controlling dangerous animals that most people wouldn't even approach. How would he adapt to a life where he needed assistance with the most basic tasks? How would their marriage survive the stress of such dramatic role changes? How would he find purpose and meaning in circumstances that bore no resemblance to anything he had planned or imagined? Emma had been staying with Mason's parents at their ranch outside Amarillo during the weeks of his initial hospitalization, but she was becoming increasingly difficult to comfort as she sensed the anxiety and fear in the adults around her. Children are remarkably perceptive about emotional undercurrents, and Emma knew that something fundamental had changed in her world, even if she couldn't understand the nature or permanence of that change. "When is Daddy coming home?" had become Emma's constant question, and the adults in her life were struggling to provide answers that were both honest and age-appropriate. How do you explain to a 4-year-old that Daddy will come home eventually, but he'll be different in ways that will affect every aspect of their family life? Dr. Williams had warned Rebecca and Mason's family about the psychological challenges that would accompany physical recovery. Depression was extremely common among spinal cord injury patients, particularly during the transition from acute medical care to rehabilitation when the full impact of permanent disability became unavoidable. The suicide rate among newly injured quadriplegics was significantly higher than in the general population, a statistic that haunted Rebecca's thoughts during the long nights she spent beside Mason's bed. "We strongly recommend counseling and support groups," Dr. Williams had explained during one of their family meetings. Individual therapy can help Mason process his grief and anger while developing coping strategies for his new circumstances. Support groups connect patients with others who have faced similar challenges and can provide practical advice about everything from equipment to relationship issues. But Mason had refused both suggestions, insisting that he could handle his emotional adjustment the same way he had handled every other challenge in his life, through sheer determination and stubborn refusal to quit. The attitude that had served him well in bull riding, where mental toughness could overcome physical limitations, was proving less effective in circumstances where determination couldn't restore what had been permanently lost. The days began to blur together in the structured routine of hospital life. Physical therapy in the morning, occupational therapy in the afternoon, respiratory therapy to prevent pneumonia, wound care to prevent the pressure sores that were a constant threat for people who couldn't change positions independently. Each day brought small victories, improved sitting balance, better appetite, stronger voice, but also constant reminders of the enormous challenges that lay ahead. Tommy Wilson made the 3-hour drive from Houston to visit Mason during his 4th week in the hospital, bringing with him the gold championship buckle he had won at the season-ending finals and a bottle of whiskey that hospital rules wouldn't allow them to open, but that represented the kind of gesture that meant everything in cowboy culture. "I should have come sooner," Tommy said, settling into the chair beside Mason's bed while trying to reconcile the vibrant competitor he remembered with the man who lay motionless under hospital blankets. "I just didn't know what to say." "Hell, I still don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," Mason replied, genuinely appreciating Tommy's honesty more than the awkward condolences and forced optimism that had filled most of his other visitors' conversations. "Just tell me about the season. Tell me what's happening out there in the real world while I'm stuck in here learning how to drink water through a straw." They talked for hours about bulls and riders, about the politics of professional rodeo, about the new generation of competitors coming up through the junior circuits. For the first time since his accident, Mason felt connected to the world he had lost, even if he could only participate as an observer rather than a competitor. The conversation was both comforting and painful, a reminder of the life he had loved and would never experience again. "I want to ask you something," Tommy said as the afternoon wound down toward evening. "The PBR is starting a comprehensive safety initiative, better medical protocols, improved protective equipment, rider education programs, research into injury prevention. They want someone with credibility to head it up, someone who understands both the risks and the culture of our sport. They asked me to talk to you about it." Mason was quiet for a long moment, processing the unexpected offer. Working with the Professional Bull Riders organization would mean staying connected to the sport he loved, but it would also mean constant reminders of what he could no longer do. More importantly, it would mean accepting a role that was defined by his injury rather than his achievements. "I don't know, Tommy," Mason said finally. "I'm not sure I'm ready to be the poster boy for what can go wrong in our sport. Right now, I can barely sit up in a wheelchair without falling over. I don't think I'm qualified to be giving advice about anything." "That's not what they want," Tommy insisted. "They want someone who can speak to riders about safety without sounding like some corporate suit who's never been on a bull. They want someone the guys will respect and listen to, someone who's been where they are and understands what they're risking every time they climb into the chute. There's nobody better qualified than you for that job, Mason." The offer planted a seed that would grow over the following weeks, as Mason began to consider what his future might look like beyond simply surviving each day. For the first time since his accident, someone was suggesting that he could contribute something meaningful to the world rather than simply being cared for by others. The idea was both appealing and terrifying. Appealing because it offered purpose and connection to the sport he loved, terrifying because it would require him to accept and embrace his new identity as a person with disabilities. Dr. Rodriguez made her final assessment of Mason's condition during his 5th week in the hospital, preparing the medical documentation that would be necessary for his transfer to the rehabilitation facility where he would spend the next phase of his recovery. The news was mixed. His spine had healed well from the surgery, his respiratory function had improved beyond their initial expectations, and his overall health was good despite the trauma he had endured. But the neurological damage was permanent and extensive. Mason would be classified as a C4, C5 incomplete quadriplegic, with limited function in his shoulders and upper arms, but no voluntary movement or sensation in his hands, trunk, or legs. He would require assistance with most activities of daily living, would need modifications to his living environment, and would face ongoing medical challenges related to his condition for the rest of his life. The good news is that Mason's injury is incomplete, which means he retained more function than many people with similar injuries, Dr. Rodriguez explained to Rebecca and Mason's family. His breathing is stable, his cognitive function is completely normal, and his remaining physical capabilities can be maximized through intensive rehabilitation. Rebecca nodded, though she was learning that good news in the context of spinal cord injury was relative and often accompanied by sobering reminders of permanent limitations. What should we expect from the rehabilitation program? The goal is to help Mason achieve the maximum possible independence within the constraints of his injury, Dr. Rodriguez replied. He'll learn to transfer from bed to wheelchair, to operate adaptive equipment for eating and computer use, to navigate in both power and manual wheelchairs. Most importantly, he'll work with psychologists and social workers to adapt emotionally and practically to his new circumstances. The rehabilitation hospital was a different world from the acute care facility where Mason had spent his first 5 weeks after the accident. Instead of focusing on medical stabilization and basic survival, the rehabilitation environment was designed to help patients adapt to permanent disabilities and prepare for life in the outside world. The facility looked more like a college dormitory than a hospital, with patients moving through hallways in wheelchairs, practicing daily living skills in mock apartments, and working toward the goal of eventual independence. Mason's roommate was Carlos Rivera, a 28-year-old construction worker from El Paso who had suffered a similar injury in a fall from scaffolding 3 months earlier. Carlos was further along in his recovery and had become adept at transferring independently, operating his power wheelchair with chin controls, and maintaining an optimistic attitude that Mason found both inspiring and occasionally irritating. The first couple of months are the hardest, Carlos told Mason during his first night in the rehabilitation facility. You spend all your time thinking about what you used to be able to do instead of figuring out what you can still do. But it gets better, man. It gets different, but it gets better. Mason wasn't sure he believed that optimism was justified, but he was beginning to understand that adaptation would require him to develop new ways of thinking about capability, independence, and success. The man who had measured achievement in 8-second increments would need to learn to celebrate victories, measured in inches of improved arm function, or successfully completing a transfer from bed to wheelchair. The daily routine in rehabilitation was demanding and often frustrating. Physical therapy focused on strengthening Mason's remaining muscle function and teaching him to compensate for his paralyzed limbs. Occupational therapy involved learning to use adaptive equipment for eating, computer operation, and personal care. Respiratory therapy helped prevent the pneumonia and other complications that were constant threats for people with high-level spinal cord injuries. But the most challenging aspect of rehabilitation was psychological. Learning to accept and integrate his new limitations while discovering sources of meaning and purpose that didn't depend on physical capability. Mason was working with Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a psychologist who specialized in adjustment to acquired disability, though their sessions often felt more like battles than therapeutic conversations. I understand that you're angry, Dr. Walsh said during one particularly difficult session. Anger is a normal and necessary part of grieving for the life you had planned. But at some point, that anger needs to become fuel for building the life that's still possible. What life is that exactly? Mason replied, his frustration evident in every word. A life where I need help going to the bathroom? Where I can't pick up my own children? Where I have to watch other people do everything I used to do for myself. That doesn't sound like much of a life to me. Dr. Walsh had worked with hundreds of people facing similar challenges, and she knew that this phase of adjustment was both necessary and painful. Mason, you're not the same person you were before your accident. That person is gone, and you need to grieve for him. But you're still here, and the person you are now has the potential for a meaningful life, even if it looks completely different from what you had planned. The sessions continued 3 times a week, slowly chipping away at Mason's resistance to accepting his new reality while helping him develop coping strategies for the emotional challenges that would extend far beyond his physical recovery. The work was exhausting and often seemed pointless, but it was gradually helping Mason understand that adaptation wasn't about returning to who he had been, it was about discovering who he could become. Rebecca was making the hour-long drive from their home in San Antonio to the rehabilitation hospital every day, bringing Emma with her when possible and trying to maintain some semblance of family life while managing her own challenges as a new mother with a 3-week-old baby. The stress was taking its toll on everyone, but particularly on Emma, who was struggling to understand why Daddy lived at the hospital and why he looked and acted so different from the father she remembered. "Can Daddy come home now?" Emma asked during one visit, climbing onto Mason's bed where she could see his face clearly. "I miss him reading me stories at bedtime." The innocent question broke Mason's heart because he didn't know how to answer it honestly. He would eventually be able to come home, but he wouldn't be able to read bedtime stories in the way Emma remembered. Sitting on the edge of her bed, using different voices for characters, acting out parts of the story with gestures and expressions. Instead, he would need assistance positioning himself in his wheelchair beside her bed, would need help holding the book, and would be limited to simply reading the words without the physical interaction that had made storytime special. But Dr. Williams had been right about one thing. Mason was gradually regaining some independence through adaptive equipment and training. He learned to operate a computer using a mouth stick when his limited arm function wasn't sufficient for keyboard use. He became proficient at eating with adapted utensils that compensated for his lack of grip strength. Most importantly, he was learning to transfer from bed to wheelchair with decreasing amounts of assistance, a skill that would be crucial for any semblance of independence in his future life. The breakthrough came during Mason's 7th week in rehabilitation, on a Tuesday morning that started like any other with physical therapy and occupational therapy sessions. Mason was working on wheelchair navigation skills, learning to operate both power and manual wheelchairs in different environments, when Tommy Wilson arrived for an unexpected visit, carrying a laptop computer and a folder full of documents. "I've got something to show you," Tommy said, settling into the chair beside Mason's wheelchair. "The PBR safety initiative I mentioned? They've been developing it while you've been in here recovering, and they really want your input on how to make it work." Tommy opened the laptop and showed Mason a preliminary website for the Professional Bull Riders Safety Foundation, complete with sections on injury prevention, rider education, equipment development, and support for injured competitors and their families. The foundation was designed to be a comprehensive approach to reducing the risks inherent in professional bull riding while providing resources for riders who suffered injuries despite safety precautions. "Look at this," Tommy said, clicking through pages of research data, equipment specifications, and educational materials. They've been studying injury patterns, working with equipment manufacturers to develop better protective gear, and creating protocols for medical care at rodeo events. But they need someone who understands the sport from a rider's perspective to make sure this stuff actually works instead of just looking good on paper. Mason studied the website with growing interest, seeing for the first time a concrete way that his experience and knowledge could contribute something meaningful to the sport he loved. The foundation wasn't just about preventing injuries like his. It was about improving the safety and medical care for all riders while preserving the essential character and challenge of professional bull riding. "What exactly would my role be?" Mason asked, though he was already beginning to envision how he could contribute to the foundation's goals. "Director of Rider Safety and Education," Tommy replied. "You'd work with riders to develop safety protocols, test new equipment, review medical procedures at events, and provide support for injured competitors. The position is based in Colorado Springs near the PBR headquarters, but you'd travel to major events and work directly with riders, stock contractors, and medical staff." The offer represented more than just employment. It was an opportunity to transform the most devastating experience of Mason's life into something that could help other riders avoid similar tragedies while improving the overall safety of professional bull riding. It would also mean accepting and embracing his new identity as a person with disabilities while using that experience to benefit others. Rebecca had been listening to the conversation from her chair beside Mason's bed, and she could see the spark of interest in her husband's eyes for the first time since his accident. The foundation position would provide not just income and purpose, but a way for Mason to remain connected to the sport he loved while contributing something meaningful to its future. "What do you think?" Mason asked Rebecca, though he was already beginning to make his decision. "I think it sounds perfect for you," Rebecca replied, meaning every word. "You've always been the guy other riders came to for advice about bulls and technique. Now you could help them with safety and injury prevention. It's like everything you've learned in 12 years of bull riding, combined with what you've learned in the past 2 months, could help make the sport safer for everyone who comes after you." Mason was quiet for several minutes, processing the implications of accepting the position and what it would mean for his family's future. They would need to relocate to Colorado Springs, which would require selling their current home and finding housing that was accessible for his wheelchair. Rebecca would need to find new employment, Emma would need to change schools, and they would be leaving behind the support network of family and friends in Texas who had sustained them through the crisis of his accident and initial recovery. But the position also offered something Mason had been desperately seeking: a way to find purpose and meaning in circumstances he had never chosen or wanted. Instead of being defined by what he could no longer do, he would be contributing to the safety and welfare of current and future bull riders while using his hard-won knowledge to benefit the sport he loved. "Tell them I'll take it," Mason said finally, his voice carrying the kind of determination that had been absent since his accident. "But I want to start as soon as I'm discharged from here. I've got a lot to learn about being disabled, but I also know more about bull riding than most people. And if I can help prevent other riders from going through what I've experienced, then maybe some good can come out of this whole nightmare." Tommy's face broke into the first genuine smile Mason had seen from any of his visitors since the accident. "That's the Mason Tully I remember. Welcome back, partner." As Tommy left the rehabilitation hospital that afternoon, carrying with him Mason's acceptance of the foundation position, Mason felt something he hadn't experienced since watching Tornado Red explode from the chute on that terrible night in San Antonio. Hope for the future. Not hope that he would recover his previous capabilities, but hope that he could build a meaningful life with the capabilities he retained. The road ahead would still be difficult, filled with challenges he was only beginning to understand. But for the first time since his accident, Mason Tully had a reason to look forward instead of backward, a purpose that extended beyond simply surviving each day, and a way to transform his devastating injury into something that could help others avoid similar tragedies. The cowboy who had once measured success in 8-second increments was learning to think in terms of decades and generations, understanding that his legacy would be written not in championship buckles and prize money, but in the lives that might be saved through the safety improvements he could help develop and implement. It wasn't the future Mason had planned, but it was a future he could embrace with the same determination that had carried him to the top levels of professional bull riding. 8 weeks and 3 days after arriving at University Hospital as a broken bull rider whose life had been shattered in 8 seconds of violence, Mason Tully wheeled himself through the automatic doors of the rehabilitation center for the last time as a patient. The man who emerged bore little resemblance to the confident cowboy who had climbed onto Tornado Red's back in what now seemed like another lifetime. His shoulders were broader from weeks of wheelchair navigation and adaptive strengthening exercises. His hands bore new calluses from gripping wheel rims and operating adaptive equipment, and his eyes held a mixture of hard-won wisdom, unhealed grief, and cautious optimism that aged him beyond his 34 years. Rebecca waited beside their modified van, their 6-week-old son David sleeping peacefully in her arms, while Emma bounced excitedly beside the vehicle's specialized lift system. The baby had arrived exactly 2 weeks after Mason's accident, as if sensing the family's need for something positive amid the overwhelming challenges they faced daily. Mason had been present for David's birth, wheeled into the delivery room in his hospital bed, but the experience had been shadowed by his inability to hold his son independently or participate in the moment the way he had when Emma was born 4 years earlier. The van itself represented a tangible symbol of how drastically their world had changed. The $38,000 vehicle featured a hydraulic lift system, hand controls for acceleration and braking, and interior modifications that accommodated Mason's power wheelchair while providing space for the family to travel together. Every modification had been paid for with funds from the Professional Bull Riders Safety Foundation and donations from the rodeo community. But each adaptation also served as a constant reminder of Mason's new limitations and dependencies. "You ready to go home, cowboy?" Rebecca asked, unconsciously using the endearment that had become both natural and painful over the weeks of his hospitalization and rehabilitation. Mason was still a cowboy in his heart and mind, but the physical reality of that identity had been stripped away entirely, leaving him to reconstruct his sense of self around capabilities he was still discovering and limitations he was still learning to accept. "As ready as I'll ever be," Mason replied, maneuvering his power wheelchair onto the van's lift platform with the competence that had developed over weeks of practice and adjustment. The process had become routine, but it still required concentration and planning that reminded him constantly of how much energy was now required for actions that had once been automatic and effortless. Their house had been completely transformed during Mason's hospitalization and rehabilitation. The Federal Americans with Disabilities Act had provided guidelines for accessibility modifications, but adapting a family home for quadriplegia required changes that went far beyond legal minimums. Doorways had been widened throughout the house. The front steps had been replaced with a gently sloping ramp that met code requirements while maintaining the home's aesthetic appeal. The master bedroom had been relocated to the first floor to eliminate stairs, and the bathroom had been completely renovated with roll-in shower access, grab bars, and emergency call systems. The kitchen had been redesigned with lowered countertops, accessible storage, and specialized appliances that Mason could operate with his limited arm function. Even seemingly minor details like light switches and door handles had been repositioned to accommodate someone operating from a seated position with restricted reach and grip strength. The modifications had cost over $90,000 and had transformed their cozy family home into something that looked more like a medical facility than a place where children played and families built their lives together. But the physical modifications were only part of the adaptation process. Rebecca had spent the weeks of Mason's rehabilitation learning to become his primary caregiver while managing their household, caring for 2 children, and preparing to return to work to help support their family financially. The disability insurance would provide 60% of Mason's previous income, but their medical expenses, equipment costs, and home modifications had depleted most of their savings while creating ongoing financial obligations that would extend for decades. Emma ran out to greet them as the van pulled into their driveway, her 4-year-old excitement undimmed by the weeks of confusion and upheaval that had surrounded Mason's accident and recovery. "Daddy's home! Daddy's home!" she shouted, dancing around the wheelchair lift as Mason transferred from van to ground level with the mechanical precision he had developed through repetitive practice and determination. "Hey there, little cowgirl," Mason said, his voice catching slightly as Emma climbed onto his lap with the unconscious confidence of a child who hadn't yet learned to see her father's wheelchair as an obstacle or limitation. "Did you miss your old dad while he was learning how to be a better patient than a bull rider?" "You're not old, Daddy," Emma replied with the literal honesty that made conversations with children both refreshing and heartbreaking. "Grandpa Jim is old. You're just hurt, but you're getting better now, right? The doctors fixed you so you could come home with us." The question hung in the air with devastating innocence. Emma's 4-year-old understanding couldn't process the permanence of her father's condition or the concept that some injuries couldn't be healed with medicine and time. In her experience, hurt things got better eventually, and doctors were magical figures who could fix whatever was broken. The idea that some changes couldn't be undone was beyond her developmental comprehension, but it was a conversation they would need to have soon as Mason's condition became undeniably permanent in their daily life together. "I'm getting stronger every day, sweetheart," Mason said carefully, unwilling to lie to his daughter, but not ready to explain the full truth of his prognosis in terms she could understand. "And I'm really happy to be home with you and Mama and baby David where we can be a family again." The first week home was both a relief and a revelation that tested every aspect of their new reality. Mason had forgotten how many small obstacles their supposedly accessible house still contained. The slight rise where different flooring materials met, the narrow space between furniture that accommodated walking but challenged wheelchair navigation, the height of items on shelves that had been positioned for someone who could stand and reach. Everything had to be relearned and adapted, turning familiar spaces into constant reminders of his changed capabilities while requiring Rebecca to become proficient at problem-solving and adaptation she had never imagined needing. Simple daily routines that had once been automatic now required elaborate planning and specialized equipment. Getting dressed required Mason to transfer from his wheelchair to the bed, then back to the wheelchair, while Rebecca assisted with clothing that had been selected for accessibility rather than style or comfort. Preparing meals involved careful coordination between Mason's limited ability to help and Rebecca's need to manage cooking while caring for an infant and supervising a preschooler who was still adjusting to her father's changed condition. The bathroom routines were particularly challenging and emotionally difficult for both Mason and Rebecca. Functions that had been private and independent for 34 years now required assistance, planning, and medical equipment that turned intimate personal care into clinical procedures. Mason's dignity and Rebecca's comfort were both tested daily as they navigated the physical realities of high-level spinal cord injury while trying to maintain their relationship as husband and wife rather than patient and caregiver. Jake Martinez visited daily during Mason's first weeks home, ostensibly to help with household tasks and transportation, but really to maintain the friendship that had sustained both men through years on the rodeo circuit. Jake was struggling with his own complicated emotions. Survivor's guilt that left him unable to fully enjoy his continued success in bull riding, combined with uncertainty about how to relate to his best friend whose life had been so dramatically altered by the sport they both loved. The season's winding down, Jake mentioned one afternoon while helping Mason organize his new home office space, which had been set up with adaptive computer equipment and communication devices that allowed him to work despite his limited hand function. "I'm sitting second in the world standings going into the finals, but every time I get on a bull, I keep thinking about that night in San Antonio and wondering if I'm going to end up wondering if something could happen to me too." "If you end up like me," Mason finished, recognizing Jake's discomfort with acknowledging the reality of his condition. "Jake, you can't live your career in fear of what might happen. Every time we climbed into a chute, we knew the risks. I knew them, you know them, and every other rider knows them. What happened to me was always a possibility. It's just a possibility that became reality." The advice was easier to give than to follow. Mason's own nights were still filled with vivid dreams where he could walk, run, and ride bulls with the physical confidence that had defined his identity for 34 years. He would wake up attempting to get out of bed to check on David's crying or reaching to embrace Rebecca, only to be reminded by his motionless legs and unresponsive hands that those simple actions were no longer possible without assistance and planning. Dr. Patricia Williams had warned them about the psychological challenges that would accompany the transition from hospital and rehabilitation center to home life, when the full impact of permanent disability became unavoidable in the context of daily family routines. Depression was common among spinal cord injury patients during this phase, particularly when the structured support of medical facilities was replaced by the reality of navigating an unchanged world with dramatically changed capabilities. She had recommended continued counseling, support groups with other spinal cord injury families, and antidepressant medications if Mason's mood continued to decline, but Mason had initially refused all three options. He insisted that he could handle his emotional adjustment through determination and stubborn refusal to surrender to circumstances beyond his control. The same approach that had carried him through 12 years of professional bull riding, where mental toughness could overcome physical limitations and temporary setbacks. But determination couldn't solve every problem or restore every capability. Simple tasks like changing David's diaper required elaborate positioning and assistance that turned what should have been intimate moments between father and son into complex procedures that highlighted Mason's limitations rather than his remaining abilities. Playing with Emma required creativity and adaptation that reminded him constantly of the physical games and activities they could no longer share in the ways they had before his accident. The financial pressures were mounting steadily as the reality of long-term disability expenses became clear. Mason's medical bills exceeded $200,000, most of which was covered by insurance, but ongoing costs for medications, equipment maintenance, attendant care, and home modifications would continue indefinitely. The Professional Bull Riders Safety Foundation had provided tremendous support during the acute phase of his crisis, but long-term financial stability would depend on Mason's ability to earn income despite his physical limitations. 3 months after his accident, Mason received the call from Tommy Wilson that would provide the opportunity he desperately needed to find meaning and purpose beyond simply surviving his changed circumstances. The PBR Safety Foundation position was officially approved, with funding secured through a combination of sponsorship deals, industry partnerships, and ongoing fundraising efforts within the professional rodeo community. "The board of directors approved your appointment unanimously," Tommy explained during his visit to Mason's home office, which had become the space where Mason spent most of his time working on computer-based projects and correspondence with other injured riders. "They want you to start as soon as you're ready, which could be immediately if you're feeling up to it." Mason had been using his weeks at home to research spinal cord injury rates in rodeo sports, studying safety equipment innovations being developed by manufacturers around the world, and corresponding with other athletes who had suffered similar injuries in various sports. The work had provided him with a sense of purpose that extended beyond simply adapting to his own condition, and he had discovered that his insights and experience could be valuable to others navigating the same devastating transition he was experiencing. "What exactly would my responsibilities include?" Mason asked, though he had been thinking about the position constantly since Tommy's initial offer months earlier during his rehabilitation. You'd oversee the development of safety protocols for all PBR events, work with equipment manufacturers to test and improve protective gear, coordinate with medical personnel to establish better injury prevention and treatment procedures, and serve as an advocate and resource for riders who suffer serious injuries, Tommy explained, reading from official documents that outline the Foundation's mission and Mason's potential role within the organization. The position would require Mason to travel to major rodeo events around the country, which presented both opportunities and challenges given his physical limitations and need for accessible accommodations. But it would also provide him with the chance to remain connected to the sport he loved while contributing to its evolution in ways that could prevent other riders from experiencing the kind of catastrophic injury that had changed his life so dramatically. There's something else, Tommy continued. The Foundation wants to establish a comprehensive support program for injured riders and their families. Financial assistance, medical advocacy, equipment provision, counseling services, everything needed to help people navigate the transition from active competition to life with disability. They want you to design and oversee that program based on your own experience and what you've learned about the needs of injured competitors. The opportunity to help other riders avoid the mistakes, delays, and unnecessary struggles that had complicated his own recovery was compelling and aligned perfectly with Mason's developing sense of purpose. He had learned through painful experience about insurance problems, equipment selection, home modification challenges, and family adjustment issues that could be addressed more effectively with proper planning and support. I want to accept the position, Mason said, his voice carrying the kind of determination that had been absent since his accident, but was now returning as he found ways to channel his experience into meaningful contribution. But I have some conditions. I want to establish support services that address not just the injured riders, but their families. Rebecca has been dealing with challenges that nobody prepared her for, and Emma's been struggling with changes that no 4-year-old should have to handle alone. Tommy nodded enthusiastically, clearly relieved by Mason's acceptance and impressed by his comprehensive approach to the Foundation's mission. The board specifically wants you to develop those family support services. They understand that spinal cord injuries affect entire families, not just the injured person. Rebecca had been listening to the conversation from the kitchen where she was preparing dinner while managing David's feeding schedule, and she could hear the renewed energy in Mason's voice for the first time since his accident. The Foundation position would provide not just income and professional purpose, but a way for Mason to transform his devastating experience into something that could help others while remaining connected to the sport that had defined so much of his adult life. But accepting the position would also require significant changes for their family. The Foundation was headquartered in Colorado Springs, which would mean relocating from Texas, where they had lived their entire married life, and where their extended families provided crucial support during the ongoing challenges of adaptation to Mason's condition. Rebecca would need to find new employment in Colorado, Emma would need to change schools and make new friends, and they would be leaving behind the medical team and support networks that had been essential during Mason's recovery. What do you think about moving to Colorado? Mason asked Rebecca as they discussed the opportunity that evening after Emma had been put to bed and David was sleeping peacefully in his crib beside their modified bedroom setup. I think it could be exactly what we all need, Rebecca replied, meaning every word despite her own anxiety about the challenges of relocating with Mason's complex medical and equipment needs. You've been struggling to find your place in this new reality, and this job would give you the chance to use everything you know about bull riding and everything you've learned about spinal cord injury to help other people. Plus, Colorado Springs has excellent medical facilities and support services for people with disabilities. The practical aspects of relocation were daunting, but manageable with proper planning and support. The Foundation would assist with finding accessible housing, and Mason's medical care could be transferred to the excellent spinal cord injury program at the University of Colorado Hospital in Denver, which was considered one of the best facilities in the country for ongoing care and support services. More importantly, the move would represent a fresh start for their family in a location where Mason's wheelchair and physical limitations would be part of their story from the beginning, rather than a dramatic change that everyone needed to adjust to and accommodate. In Colorado Springs, they could build relationships and community connections that included Mason's disability as a natural part of who he was, rather than as a tragic alteration of who he had been. Let's do it, Mason said finally, his decision carrying the weight of commitment that had once applied to 8-second bull rides, but now extended to the decades of life and purpose that stretched ahead of him. Let's move to Colorado, and let's see if we can help make professional bull riding safer for everyone who loves the sport as much as we do. The next several weeks were consumed with the complex logistics of relocating a family that now included specialized medical equipment, accessibility requirements, and support services that hadn't been necessary before Mason's accident. The foundation had arranged for a temporary housing allowance while they searched for permanent accessible housing, and Mason's medical records were transferred to his new healthcare team in Colorado. Emma was initially resistant to the idea of leaving her grandparents and the familiar environment of Texas, but her 4-year-old adaptability proved stronger than her anxiety about change. The prospect of seeing mountains and snow, neither of which existed in their part of Texas, eventually overcame her reluctance to leave the only home she had ever known. The drive to Colorado Springs took 2 days with Mason's wheelchair and medical equipment, plus stops to accommodate his needs for positioning changes, bathroom assistance, and the fatigue that still accompanied extended travel. But when they finally arrived at their new home, a ranch-style house that had been specifically designed for wheelchair accessibility, Mason felt a sense of possibility that had been absent since his accident. The house featured wide doorways, roll-in showers, adjustable countertops, and technology that allowed Mason to control lighting, temperature, and security systems through voice commands or minimal hand movements. More importantly, it was located in a neighborhood where several other families included members with various disabilities, creating a community environment where wheelchairs and adaptive equipment were normal rather than remarkable. Mason's first day at the Professional Bull Riders Safety Foundation offices was both exciting and nerve-wracking. He had been away from professional environments for over 4 months, and he was unsure about how his colleagues would react to his wheelchair and obvious physical limitations. But the warm welcome from the foundation staff, many of whom had known him during his competitive career, helped ease his transition into his new role. His office had been specially configured with adjustable desk heights, accessible computer equipment, and communication devices that accommodated his limited hand function while allowing him to work effectively with riders, equipment manufacturers, and medical professionals around the world. The foundation had also hired a part-time personal assistant to help with tasks that required fine motor skills or physical abilities beyond Mason's current capabilities. "Welcome to your new career, partner," said Dr. Michael Chun, the foundation's medical director and a sports medicine physician who had treated rodeo injuries for over 15 years. "We've got a lot of work to do, and frankly, we've been waiting for someone with your combination of riding experience and personal understanding of serious injury to help us figure out how to make this sport safer without destroying what makes it special." The work was immediately engaging and meaningful in ways that Mason hadn't experienced since his accident. He began by conducting comprehensive interviews with riders who had suffered various injuries, documenting patterns and circumstances that could inform prevention strategies. He worked with equipment manufacturers to test new designs for protective vests, helmets, and other safety gear that could reduce injury rates without interfering with the essential aspects of bull riding competition. Most importantly, he began developing the family support program that would provide resources, advocacy, and practical assistance for riders who suffered serious injuries and their families who were suddenly thrust into the complex world of disability, medical care, and long-term adaptation. The program would address everything from immediate crisis support to long-term financial planning, drawing on Mason's personal experience with the challenges that had complicated his own recovery. Rebecca found employment with a physical therapy practice that specialized in spinal cord injury rehabilitation, work that allowed her to use her experience as Mason's caregiver while contributing to their family's financial stability and her own professional development. Emma enrolled in a local elementary school that had excellent special education resources and a student body that included children from families dealing with various disabilities and medical conditions. 6 months after his accident, Mason made his first public appearance at a professional bull riders event since that terrible night in San Antonio. The Denver National Western Stock Show was hosting a PBR competition, and Mason had been invited to present the safety awards and address the riders about the foundation's new injury prevention initiatives. Rolling into the arena that evening was emotionally overwhelming. The familiar sounds of bulls, the sight of riders preparing their equipment, the energy of competition that had defined so much of his adult life. All of it brought back memories of who he had been and dreams of what he had expected his life to become. But it also represented his new purpose and the meaning he had found in circumstances he would never have chosen. "Ladies and gentlemen," the announcer's voice echoed through the arena, "please welcome Mason Tully, director of the Professional Bull Riders Safety Foundation and one of the most respected competitors in the history of our sport." The standing ovation lasted for several minutes, with riders, stock contractors, and fans acknowledging both Mason's competitive achievements and his courage in returning to the sport in his new capacity. When the applause finally quieted, Mason rolled his wheelchair to the microphone and looked out at the faces of people who represented his past, present, and future. 8 months ago, I was sitting where some of you are sitting right now, getting ready to ride a bull named Tornado Red in San Antonio, Mason began, his voice strong and clear despite the emotion he felt at being back in a rodeo arena. "I thought I knew everything about the risks we take every time we climb into a chute. I thought I understood what I was willing to sacrifice for 8 seconds of glory and the chance to be a champion." The arena was completely silent, every person present understanding that they were hearing from someone who had paid the ultimate price that their sport could demand while somehow finding a way to transform that experience into service to others. "What I didn't understand was how much my accident would affect my family, my friends, and everyone who cared about me," Mason continued. "I didn't understand that when I made the choice to risk my own life and health, I was also making choices for my wife, my children, and everyone whose lives were connected to mine." He paused, looking out at the young riders who reminded him of himself at their age. Fearless, confident, convinced that serious injury happened to other people in other places. "I'm not here to tell you to quit bull riding or to be afraid of the risks that make our sport challenging and exciting," Mason said. "I'm here to tell you that we can be smarter about those risks. We can use better equipment, follow better safety protocols, and take care of each other in ways that preserve what we love about this sport while protecting what matters most: our ability to go home to our families and live full lives whether we win or lose." The speech concluded with another standing ovation, but more importantly, it marked Mason's complete transition from competitive athlete to safety advocate and educator. He was no longer the man who had been broken by 8 seconds of violence in a San Antonio arena, but rather someone who had found ways to use that experience to protect others while remaining connected to the sport he loved. Over the following months, the Safety Foundation's programs began to show measurable results. Injury rates at PBR events decreased by 18% in the first year after Mason's safety protocols were implemented. The Family Support Program provided assistance to 23 injured riders and their families, helping them navigate medical care, insurance issues, and long-term adaptation with resources and advocacy that hadn't existed when Mason was dealing with his own recovery. Emma adapted to their new life in Colorado Springs with the resilience that children often display when faced with changes that overwhelm adults. She made friends easily, developed a love for the mountains that surrounded their new home, and began to see her father's wheelchair as simply part of who he was rather than as a limitation or tragedy that defined their family. Her acceptance and adaptation helped Mason understand that his condition didn't have to be the most important thing about him unless he chose to make it so. David grew from an infant into a toddler who had never known his father without a wheelchair, and their relationship developed naturally around Mason's capabilities rather than his limitations. Mason learned to play games that he could manage from his seated position, to help with feeding and basic care within his physical abilities, and to be present and engaged as a father in ways that didn't require the physical strength and mobility he had lost. Rebecca's role evolved from crisis manager and primary caregiver to partner in building their new life together. While she still provided assistance with many of Mason's daily needs, their relationship had begun to regain some of the equality and mutual support that had characterized their marriage before his accident. The move to Colorado Springs, Mason's meaningful work with the foundation, and their gradual adaptation to their changed circumstances had helped restore much of what had seemed lost in the immediate aftermath of his injury. 2 years after his accident, Mason received an unexpected phone call from Dr. Rodriguez at University Hospital in San Antonio. A young bull rider named Marcus Williams had suffered a spinal cord injury remarkably similar to Mason's, and his family was struggling with the same overwhelming challenges that had confronted Mason during his own early recovery. "I know this is asking a lot," Dr. Rodriguez said, "but Marcus and his family could really benefit from talking to someone who's been through what they're facing. You've found ways to build a meaningful life after your injury, and I think your perspective could help them understand that their situation isn't hopeless." The request represented a full-circle moment for Mason. 2 years earlier, he had been the one lying in a hospital bed, terrified about his future and unable to imagine any life worth living in his new circumstances. Now he was being asked to provide hope and guidance to someone facing the same devastating transition he had somehow managed to navigate successfully. "Of course I'll talk to him," Mason replied without hesitation. "And tell his family that they can call me anytime, day or night. Nobody should have to go through this alone." The conversation with Marcus Williams lasted for 2 hours and covered everything from medical decisions and equipment selection to family relationships and finding purpose after catastrophic injury. Mason found himself sharing insights and perspectives that he hadn't realized he possessed, drawn from 2 years of adaptation, growth, and gradual reconstruction of his identity and goals. "The hardest part isn't learning to live with paralysis," Mason told Marcus during their second conversation. "The hardest part is learning to live with being different from who you were before, and discovering that different doesn't necessarily mean worse. It just means you have to find new ways to be the person you want to be." As the 3rd anniversary of his accident approached, Mason reflected on the journey that had taken him from a championship-caliber bull rider to a safety advocate whose work was helping to protect other riders from experiencing similar tragedies. The transformation had been painful, difficult, and often seemed impossible, but it had also revealed capabilities and sources of meaning that he had never imagined possessing. He would never walk again, never ride bulls, never experience the physical capabilities that had defined his identity for the first 34 years of his life. But he had discovered that identity was more flexible than he had understood, that purpose could be found in circumstances he would never have chosen, and that meaningful contribution to the world didn't require the specific abilities he had lost. Emma was now 6 years old and had grown into a confident, compassionate child who understood that people faced different challenges and possessed different abilities. She was proud of her father's work with the Safety Foundation and had begun to understand that his accident, while tragic, had led to changes that were helping other families avoid similar experiences. David was walking and talking, developing into a toddler who loved climbing onto his father's wheelchair and helping with computer work that he didn't understand but recognized as important. Mason's relationship with both of his children had evolved around his actual capabilities rather than grief for capabilities he had lost, creating family bonds that were strong and natural despite the adaptations required by his condition. Rebecca had returned to school to complete a master's degree in rehabilitation counseling, inspired by their family's experience and her desire to help other families navigate the complex challenges of adaptation to acquired disability. Her work combined professional development with personal mission in ways that strengthened both their individual growth and their relationship as partners in building their life together. The house in Colorado Springs had truly become home, filled with the equipment and adaptations necessary for Mason's condition, but also with the warmth, laughter, and daily routines that defined a family life that was successful and satisfying despite being completely different from what any of them had originally planned or expected. On the evening of the 3rd anniversary of his accident, Mason sat in his office reviewing injury statistics that showed continued improvement in rider safety since the implementation of the Foundation's protocols. The work was far from complete. Bull riding would always be dangerous, and injuries would continue to occur despite the best prevention efforts. But measurable progress was being made in protecting riders while preserving the essential character of the sport. Jake Martinez called that evening, as he had on every anniversary since Mason's accident, to check on his friend and report on his own continued success in professional bull riding. Jake had won the World Championship the year after Mason's accident and had dedicated the victory to his friend's recovery and adaptation, but their friendship had evolved to accommodate the changes in both their lives. "How are you doing, partner?" Jake asked, using the greeting that had connected them through years of shared travels and mutual support. "I'm doing well," Mason replied, and for the first time since his accident, the answer was completely honest rather than diplomatic. "I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be, doing exactly what I'm supposed to be doing. It's not the life I planned, but it's a good life." The conversation continued for an hour, covering everything from Jake's competitive season to Mason's latest safety initiatives to their family's ongoing adaptation and growth. The friendship had survived Mason's accident and the dramatic changes it had brought to their lives, evolving into something deeper and more meaningful than their original bond as traveling partners and competitors. As Mason prepared for bed that evening, assisted by Rebecca in the routines that had become natural over 3 years of practice and adaptation, he reflected on the journey that had brought him from the arena floor in San Antonio to the meaningful life he had built in Colorado Springs. The 8 seconds that had changed everything had indeed been devastating, but they had not been defeating. The cowboy who had once measured success in 8-second increments had learned to think in terms of decades and generations, understanding that his legacy would be written not in championship records, but in the lives that were protected through the safety improvements he had helped develop and implement. His identity had been reconstructed around contribution rather than competition, around service rather than conquest, around the long-term impact he could have on the sport he loved rather than the short-term glory he had once pursued. 8 seconds had changed everything, but Mason Tully had discovered that everything could be changed again, rebuilt around new possibilities and purposes that honored both who he had been and who he had become. The fall that had seemed to end his story had actually been the beginning of a different story, one that would continue for decades and would ultimately touch more lives than his competitive career ever could have reached. If this story moved you, subscribe to the channel and leave your like so you don't miss any of our stories.